It all started on a quiet evening, the kind of evening that usually felt peaceful, almost comforting. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. I had just finished dinner and was heading to the living room to relax when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Sarah was in there with her sister, Emily. Their tones were hushed, but not hushed enough. I paused, not intending to eavesdrop, but something in the way they were speaking caught my attention. There was a tension in the air, a weight to their words that made me stop in my tracks. I leaned against the wall just outside the kitchen, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. Emily's voice was low but urgent. "You're pregnant by your lover," she said, her words slicing through the silence like a knife. My breath caught in my throat. Pregnant lover. The words didn't make sense at first. They felt like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. I stood there, frozen, waiting for Sarah to respond, hoping she would laugh it off, call it a joke, anything to make this nightmare go away. But she didn't. Her voice was calm, almost cold, as she replied, "I'll say it's my husband's. They look alike anyway." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the room spin, my knees go weak. I clutched the door frame to steady myself, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? Who was this man? And how could she be so calculating, so heartless, as to plan this deception so casually? I stumbled away from the kitchen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I made it to the bedroom and closed the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness that I couldn't quite put into words. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, was a lie. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of it all. Sarah and I had been married for 5 years. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but I never imagined she would do something like this. I thought we were happy, or at least content. I thought we trusted each other. But now, hearing those words, I realized how wrong I had been. She had been living a double life, and I had been completely oblivious. The anger started to build, a slow, simmering rage that made my hands shake. I wanted to storm into the kitchen, confront her, demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the fear of what I might do in the heat of the moment. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm, to think. I needed proof. I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal before I made any decisions. I spent the rest of the evening pretending everything was normal. I smiled when she spoke to me, nodded along with her stories, but inside, I was dying. Every word out of her mouth felt like a lie. Every touch felt like a betrayal. I couldn't look at her without seeing the image of her with someone else, without imagining the life she had been living behind my back. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I thought about all the times she had come home late, all the times she had been distant or distracted. I thought about the little things I had brushed off, the excuses I had made for her. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed the signs? But more than anything, I thought about what came next. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. And once I had the truth, I needed to decide what to do with it. The thought of confronting her, of ending our marriage, was terrifying. But the thought of staying, of living with this betrayal, was even worse. As the hours passed, I made a decision. I would find out everything I could about her affair. I would gather the evidence I needed to confront her, to make sure she couldn't lie her way out of this. And then, when the time was right, I would make her face the consequences of her actions. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't let her get away with this. She had shattered my trust, my heart, and my life, and now it was my turn to take control. The days that followed were a blur of numbness and rage. I went through the motions of my daily life work, meals, conversations, but inside, I was a storm of emotions. Every time I looked at Sarah, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could she sit there, smiling and laughing, as if nothing was wrong? How could she pretend to be the loving wife when she had been living a lie for who knows how long it took? Every ounce of self-control I had to keep my composure, to act like everything was normal. But beneath the surface, I was plotting. I needed to know the full truth, and I needed to make sure she couldn't twist her way out of it. I started by hiring a private investigator. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but I knew I couldn't uncover the truth on my own. I needed someone who could dig into Sarah's life without her knowing, someone who could follow her, track her movements, and find out who this man was. The investigator was a professional, calm and methodical, and he assured me he'd get the answers I needed. It was expensive, but at that point, I didn't care. I would have paid anything to know the truth. While I waited for the investigator's report, I threw myself into work. It was the only thing that kept me sane. I stayed late at the office, took on extra projects, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how busy I was, the thoughts always crept back in. I'd find myself staring at my computer screen, my mind replaying that conversation in the kitchen over and over again. They look alike anyway. Those words haunted me. Was that why she had chosen him? Because he resembled me? Or was it just a cruel coincidence? When the investigator finally called me with his findings, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them, but I knew I had to. I met him at a quiet cafe, far from where Sarah or anyone we knew might see us. He handed me a folder filled with photos, receipts, and notes. As I flipped through them, my stomach churned. There she was, smiling at a man I didn't recognize, holding his hand, kissing him in places that were supposed to be ours. They met at cafes, went to hotels, even took weekend trips together. The investigator had tracked their movements for weeks, and the evidence was undeniable. Sarah had been living a double life, and she had been careful but not careful enough. The man in the photos was tall, with dark hair, and a build similar to mine. I could see why Sarah had said we looked alike. It was almost laughable, in a twisted way. She had chosen someone who could pass for me, someone who could make her lies more believable. But as I stared at his face, I felt nothing but disgust. This was the man she had betrayed me for. This was the man she had chosen over our marriage. The investigator's report also included details about their relationship. They had been seeing each other for months, maybe longer. They met regularly, often during times when Sarah had told me she was working late or running errands. She had lied to me so many times, so easily, that it made me question everything. Had our entire marriage been a lie? Had she ever truly loved me? Or had I just been a convenient cover for her real life? As I sat there, staring at the photos, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The initial shock and pain were still there, but they were joined by something else: determination. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I wasn't going to let her twist the truth or manipulate me into forgiving her. She had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. That's when the idea came to me. The baby shower was coming up, and Sarah had been planning it for weeks. It was supposed to be a celebration, a happy occasion, where we would reveal the baby's gender to our friends and family. But now, it would be something else entirely. I would use that moment to expose her lies, to make sure everyone knew the truth. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but I knew it had to be public. She had humiliated me in the most intimate way possible, and now it was my turn to do the same. I spent the next few days planning. I printed out the photo of her lover and drafted the divorce papers. I bought a balloon, the kind you pop to reveal the baby's gender, and carefully stuffed the photo and papers inside. It was a risky move, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the same shock and humiliation I had felt when I overheard her conversation. I wanted her to know that I knew the truth, and that I wasn't going to let her get away with it. As the day of the baby shower approached, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was anxious, unsure of how things would play out. but another part of me felt a grim satisfaction. Sarah had thought she could deceive me, but she had underestimated me. She had thought she could control the narrative, but now I was the one holding the cards. And when the time came, I would play them. The day of the baby shower arrived, and the house was buzzing with activity. Sarah had been planning this for weeks, and it showed. The living room was decorated with pastel-colored balloons, streamers, and banners that read "Baby Love" in cheerful cursive. A table was set up with cupcakes, finger sandwiches, and a large cake shaped like a baby carriage. Guests were milling about, laughing and chatting, their voices blending into a low hum of excitement. Sarah was at the center of it all, glowing as she greeted everyone, her hand resting on her growing belly. She looked happy, carefree, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I stood in the corner of the room, watching her, my stomach churning with a mix of anger and anticipation. I had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, and now that it was here, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew what I had to do, and I was ready. The balloon was hidden in a bag in the hallway, waiting for its moment. I had rehearsed this in my mind 100 times, but now that the moment was here, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to expose her in front of everyone? But then I remembered her voice, cold and calculating, as she planned to pass off another man's child as mine. Any hesitation I had vanished. The baby shower proceeded as planned. There were games, gifts, and plenty of laughter. Sarah opened presents, holding up tiny onesies and stuffed animals for everyone to see. She was radiant, the picture of a happy, expectant mother. But every time she smiled, every time she laughed, I felt a pang of bitterness. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that her perfect little world was about to come crashing down. Finally, it was time for the gender reveal. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Sarah stood in the center of the room, holding the balloon, a look of excitement on her face. The guests gathered around, their phones out, ready to capture the moment. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. Sarah popped the balloon, and for a split second, there was silence. Then, instead of pink or blue confetti, the photo of her lover and the divorce papers fluttered to the ground. The room went still. Sarah froze, her smile fading as she stared at the papers in her hands. Her face went pale, her hands trembling as she picked up the photo. I could see the moment it hit her, the moment she realized what was happening. Her eyes darted to me, wide with shock and fear. I didn't wait for her to speak. I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. "I'm done," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "This baby isn't my problem." The room erupted into whispers, but I didn't stay to hear them. I grabbed my bag and walked out, leaving Sarah standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of her lies. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, of course. I had finally confronted her, finally taken control of the situation. But there was also a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. We were supposed to be a family, supposed to be happy. But Sarah had destroyed that, and now there was no going back. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I checked into a hotel and spent the night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about everything that had happened, everything that had led to this moment. I thought about Sarah, about the life we had built together, and how easily she had thrown it all away. I thought about the baby, about the life it would have, and how none of this was its fault. But most of all, I thought about myself. I had spent so much of my life trying to make Sarah happy, trying to be the perfect husband. And for what? So she could betray me, lie to me, and try to pass off another man's child as mine. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I wasn't going to let Sarah's betrayal define me. I was going to move on, to rebuild my life, and to find happiness on my own terms. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew I could do it. I had already taken the first step by confronting her, by standing up for myself, and now I was ready to take the next one. As I packed my bag and checked out of the hotel, I felt a sense of determination. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was in control. Sarah had made her choices, and now she would have to live with the consequences. But I wasn't going to let her choices dictate my life anymore. I was done. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The days and weeks that followed the baby shower were a whirlwind of chaos and quiet reflection. The fallout from that day was immediate and far-reaching. Sarah tried to call me, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but I ignored every attempt. I had said what I needed to say, and there was nothing left to discuss. Her voice, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a stranger's. Every time my phone buzzed with her name on the screen, I felt a mix of anger and sadness, but I never answered. I couldn't. I needed space, time to process everything that had happened, and to figure out what came next. The divorce papers I had served her at the baby shower were just the beginning. I filed them officially, making it clear that there was no going back. Sarah fought it at first, trying to claim that I was overreacting, that we could work through this, but I stood my ground. The evidence was undeniable: the photos, the investigator's report, the DNA test that confirmed the baby wasn't mine. She had no defense, no way to twist the truth this time. Her family, who had once been so supportive of her, turned on her when they learned the full extent of her betrayal. Even her sister, Emily, who had been complicit in her lies, distanced herself. Sarah was alone, and for the first time she had to face the consequences of her actions. The legal process was long and exhausting, but I was determined to see it through. I wanted a clean break, a final end to the life we had shared. The court proceedings were brutal at times, with Sarah's lawyers trying to paint me as the villain, as someone who had abandoned her in her time of need. But the evidence spoke for itself. The judge saw through her lies, and in the end, the divorce was granted. Sarah was ordered to pay restitution for the fraud she had committed by trying to pass off another man's child as mine. It wasn't about the money for me. It was about holding her accountable, about making sure she couldn't just walk away from what she had done. But the consequences didn't stop there. Sarah's actions had legal ramifications that went beyond our divorce. She was charged with fraud, and the case went to trial. I didn't attend the hearings. I couldn't bring myself to sit in a courtroom and listen to the details of her betrayal all over again. But I followed the case from a distance, through updates from my lawyer and the occasional news article. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Sarah was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. When I heard the news, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction. She had lied, cheated, and tried to manipulate me, and now she was facing the consequences. But another part of me felt a deep sadness. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. We had been married, had shared a life together, and now she was going to prison. It was a stark reminder of how far we had fallen, of how much had been lost. In the months that followed, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and challenges to keep my mind occupied. I reconnected with friends and family, people who had been there for me through everything. They didn't ask too many questions, for which I was grateful. They just listened, offered their support, and reminded me that I wasn't alone. I also started therapy, something I had never considered before but now realized I desperately needed. Talking to someone who wasn't involved in the situation, who could offer an outside perspective, was incredibly helpful. It allowed me to process my emotions, to work through the anger and betrayal, and to start thinking about what I wanted for my future. Therapy wasn't a magic fix, but it gave me the tools I needed to move forward. One of the hardest parts of all this was dealing with the guilt. Not guilt over what I had done. I knew I had made the right decision in leaving Sarah and holding her accountable. But guilt over the baby. None of this was the child's fault, and yet it would grow up in the shadow of its mother's mistakes. I thought about that often, wondering what kind of life it would have, whether it would ever know the truth about its father. But in the end, I had to remind myself that it wasn't my responsibility. Sarah had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. As time went on, the sharp edges of my pain began to dull. The anger and betrayal were still there, but they no longer consumed me. I started to feel like myself again, or at least a version of myself that I could live with. I took up new hobbies, things I had always wanted to try but never had the time for. I traveled, visited places I had always dreamed of seeing. I even started dating again, tentatively at first, but with a growing sense of hope. It wasn't easy trusting someone new after what I had been through felt impossible at times. But I was determined not to let Sarah's betrayal define me, not to let it rob me of the chance to find happiness again. Looking back, I can see how far I've come. The road hasn't been easy, and there have been plenty of setbacks along the way. But I've learned to take things one day at a time, to focus on the present rather than dwelling on the past. Sarah's betrayal will always be a part of my story, but it doesn't have to be the whole story. I've taken back control of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm moving forward, and that's enough. It's been a year since that fateful baby shower, and life has slowly started to find a new rhythm. The initial storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, has settled into something quieter, something more manageable. Time has a way of doing that, of softening the sharp edges of pain and allowing you to breathe again. But healing isn't linear, and there are still moments when the weight of everything that happened feels overwhelming. Those moments come less often now, but when they do, I let myself feel them. I've learned that trying to push the pain away only makes it worse. Instead, I sit with it, acknowledge it, and then let it pass. Sarah's imprisonment was a turning point for me. It wasn't just about justice being served, it was about closure. Knowing that she was facing the consequences of her actions allowed me to start letting go. I don't think about her as much anymore, and when I do, it's with a sense of detachment, like she's someone I used to know a long time ago. I've heard bits and pieces about how she's doing through mutual acquaintances or the occasional news article, but I try not to dwell on it. Her life is no longer my concern, and I've worked hard to keep it that way. Rebuilding my life hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. I've thrown myself into my career, taking on projects that challenge me and push me out of my comfort zone. Work has become a source of stability, a place where I can focus my energy and see tangible results. It's not just about distraction anymore, it's about finding purpose and fulfillment in something I'm passionate about. I've also reconnected with old friends and family, people who had been there for me during the darkest moments. Their support has been invaluable, a reminder that I'm not alone, even when it feels like it. One of the most significant steps in my healing journey has been therapy. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't think I needed it, or maybe I was just afraid of what I might uncover if I started digging too deep. But therapy has been one of the best decisions I've ever made. It's given me a safe space to process everything that happened, to unpack the anger and betrayal, and to start rebuilding my sense of self. My therapist has helped me see that Sarah's actions were a reflection of her, not me. I didn't deserve what she did, and her betrayal doesn't define my worth. It's a lesson I'm still learning, but it's one that's changed the way I see myself and the world around me. I've also started to open myself up to the possibility of love again. It's been a slow process, and there are still moments when the fear of being hurt feels paralyzing. But I've realized that shutting myself off from love isn't the answer. It's not fair to me, and it's not fair to the people who care about me. I've started dating again, taking things one step at a time. It's not about finding someone to replace what I lost. It's about finding someone who values honesty, trust, and respect the things that were missing in my marriage. I'm not in a rush, and I'm okay with that. For now, I'm focusing on building connections, on learning to trust again, and on being open to whatever the future holds. One of the most unexpected parts of this journey has been the sense of freedom I've found. For so long, I felt trapped by Sarah's lies, by the weight of her betrayal, by the life we had built together. But now, I feel like I'm finally living for myself. I've taken up new hobbies, things I've always wanted to try but never had the time or courage for. I've traveled to places I've always dreamed of visiting, immersing myself in new cultures and experiences. I've even started writing, something I hadn't done since college. It's been cathartic, a way to process my thoughts and emotions in a way that feels productive and meaningful. There are still moments when the past feels too close, when the memories of what happened threaten to pull me back into that dark place. But those moments are fewer and farther between now. I've learned to recognize them for what they are, echoes of a life I've left behind, and to let them pass without giving them power over me. I've also learned to be kinder to myself, to acknowledge how far I've come, and to celebrate the small victories along the way. Healing isn't about forgetting, it's about finding a way to live with the scars and still move forward. As I look to the future, I feel a sense of hope that I didn't think was possible a year ago. I don't know what's next, and that's okay. I've learned that life rarely goes according to plan, and that's not always a bad thing. What matters is how you respond to the challenges, how you pick yourself up and keep going. I've done that, and I'm proud of myself for it. I've taken back control of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Sarah's betrayal will always be a part of my story, but it's not the whole story. It's a chapter, one that taught me hard lessons about trust, resilience, and self-worth. But it's a chapter I've closed, and now I'm ready to start writing the next one. Whatever it holds, I know I'll face it with the same strength and determination that got me through the darkest days. And for now, that's enough.